Has populism killed democracy? Wherever you are in the world, welcome to another edition of Jerry's Take on China, and I'm Jerry. There are two aspects to this comment, and one is, what is democracy? The other is, how is it different from populism? Stick with me for a few minutes and I'll provide some examples of both. You can form your own opinions and see if you agree with me. If it's different, that's no problem. We can discuss them in the comments and I'm happy to learn something new. First of all, let's look at a couple of definitions of democracy. One is government by the people. Well, that's the obvious one, but it's a little difficult to obtain because what happens when more than one person wants to be the leader? So that's where the second definition comes in. A government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation, usually involving periodically held free elections. I'm guessing that this is a better definition. And it's exactly what seems to happen in the USA, the UK, Canada, Australia, and several other countries, right? Wrong. It's not what happens in any of those countries. The problem is with the wording. Power is vested in the people. And let me give you some examples of how that's not true at all. The people have no power. In Canada recently, when the people protested, the government imposed new laws, seized their bank accounts, they made mass arrests, and they issued thousands of infringement notices. These weren't small numbers of people who were protesting. These were massive numbers of people who haven't been listened to. On paper, they have power vested in them by the Constitution, but the electoral system takes it away with something called first past the post. This means that a Canadian MP can be elected with a very small number of votes, just by having more than the other candidates. And Justin Trudeau's party are in power in Canada at the moment, having achieved less than a third of the votes. In 1867, that also happened with John Macdonald's Labour Party taking power, 34.7% of the votes then. For Trudeau now, it's 33%. That's not the power vested in the people. It means 67% of the people who voted are not getting the representation that they wanted. The UK is even worse. Who voted for Rishi Sunak to be Prime Minister? The answer is 202 people. His hugely unpopular predecessor, Liz Truss, did marginally better. She got 81,000 votes to become leader, and that was a job she only held for 6 weeks. The Independent newspaper held a poll. 420,000 people voted for a general election to nominate a new leader after Boris Johnson had let them down so badly. That call was ignored. Even worse, a YouGov poll found that 63% of people didn't want Rishi Sunak as their Prime Minister. They wanted a general election instead. They got a leadership election. They won't get their wish until January 2025, by which time their unelected leader could have damaged the future of Britain's economy beyond repair. Once again, an example of the power not being vested in the people. In Australia, a very strange system of preferences stops the people getting their choice. They say it's a good system, but I disagree. First of all, there's a law that says everyone on the voters' register must vote. It's compulsory. In a democracy, isn't the first option choice? But you don't get that in Australia. You vote or you get fined. Secondly, if a candidate doesn't get to 50% of the vote, they don't get to go to Parliament until preferences have been counted. And if you vote, you might have 15 candidates in your electorate. You need to vote for all 15 of them in order of preference, listed number 1 to number 15. If you don't, your vote won't count. If you do, and your first choice only gets 45%, but your second choice had 40%, if more people voted for that person as their second choice, that's the person who wins the election. Once again, the power vested in you to choose your representative has been taken away by a system of choice. The USA has a very complicated system of primaries, caucuses, electoral colleges, and the popular vote isn't necessarily the one that gets in. It will depend on the electoral college. Now, I'm not going to go into too deep here. It would be far too long. But the Irish Journal did a very good analysis of that, and I've linked it here. What really is surprising, according to a team of researchers, a president can win the election based on 27% of the popular vote. That doesn't happen often, but Hillary Clinton did beat Donald Trump. Al Gore did beat George Bush, and neither of them went on to become president, despite winning the popular vote. Once again, the system prevented the power vested in the people being properly exercised. And then we come to the old issue of term limits. This was recently big because people outside of China who know nothing about how Xi Jinping got elected to the top job, they all seem to think he's made himself president for life. But why is he different from Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister for almost 12 years, or Robert Walpole, who served almost 21 years? So if Britain, the home of the Westminster system of democracy, doesn't have or need term limits, why does anyone else need them? Japan, one of China's neighbors, doesn't have term limits. The US Senate, the US Congress, even the office of the Vice President, they don't have term limits. And for the record, neither do Australia, Canada, New Zealand, or dozens of other countries around the world. What's the big deal when China decides it doesn't need them? From an earlier video I made, I've shown how Chinese government leaders need to face both selection and election processes. It isn't easy. They need to be qualified, experienced, and have a proven track record before they can move on. And this might account for why China has done so well in economic growth, educational growth, science and technology innovation, as well as infrastructure and lifestyle improvements. Because the leaders are answerable not just to the people they represent, they're answerable to the peers they work with, the subordinates they lead, and the supervisors that they aspire to replace. US government leaders, on the other hand, they need money. The cost of getting elected isn't really known. Even the National Conference of State Legislators can't pin down the real cost. But the last few elections have all gone over 5 billion, and the next one will probably be 10 billion. They need popular support, and they buy that support by paying for advertising and promotions on various media platforms. Where do they get the money? They get it from donors. Some of them are small, grassroots donors. Others are larger, corporate sponsors. Ask yourself this. If a donor gives me $5 a month from their hard-earned income, will I represent that donor as much as the lobbyist who gave me $10,000 last month and has promised the same amount next month and the month after, as long as I continue to provide them with the outcomes they desire? Ask yourself again, if that donor is giving me and my opposition in the lead up to an election $10,000, what's the motivation? It clearly isn't about my politics, it's about getting my attention. There is an accountability page and a donation tracker, and the number of corporate donors who donate to both parties is very large. Are these corporations helping politicians to help people, or are they helping politicians to help themselves? Are they diluting or even removing the power vested in the people? I think so. You have to decide for yourself. And finally, I come to the part that caused me to start this train of thought. Has populism taken over democracy? And I'm an Australian. I want to see Australia doing well. I work hard to popularize Australia and Australian products, but I live in China. Australian media won't talk to me, or if they do, it's to denigrate me. I'll make a video about that soon. Without naming names, I was shocked last year when an academic I know spoke out on China. This academic did not at any time say there was no genocide in Xinjiang or there were no human rights abuses going on. What they said was the evidence linked to it isn't clear. And it had many flaws. It needs further investigation before real opinions should be formed. A massive outpouring of anger on social media complaints to the university, and the academic was suddenly removed from the post they'd held for several years. They were forced to take long service leave and removed from the position they held to be employed again several weeks later in a lower role. This wasn't for being supportive of China, but just for asking that the information accusing China be subject to valid verification processes, which to this day it still hasn't been. When was the last time we saw a politician say something positive about China? Everything they might say as positive has to be tempered with some degree of but. This isn't confined to Australia. It's endemic throughout the group of countries that call themselves democracies and also call themselves the international community. How does it happen? It happens because media, opposition, and think tanks are all paid to make people think like this. If you really think about it, when was the last time you heard a Chinese politician actually say anything aggressive? Everything they say is defensive, it's responsive, and everything they seem to do is in response to an act of aggression against China. Now, many people will argue this fact because they've read headlines that suggest China is aggressive. The truth is this: read any news, watch any media coming out of China. Get it translated, Google or some Chinese speaker that you trust, not by a media outlet. I promise you the interpretation will be different to the one that you've read in the media. Media has created a world in which people think of China as aggressive, or they think of China as their enemy. And consequently, anyone who speaks up against what they've read, seen, or believed must, by virtue of them thinking differently, be paid for by the CPC, Chinese media, or some other underhand, sinister system designed to undermine a democracy which seems fairly clear no longer exists. The power vested in people has been wrenched away and replaced by something they call democracy, which provides none of the benefits of democracy and all of the attributes of authoritarianism. Once again, feel free to comment and I'll do my best to get back to you. And thanks again for watching Jerry's Take on China. I'll see you next time.